After discovering the first T-shaped pillar buried at the site, he soon found more of these massive structures.
Before his death, archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, the man who brought Göbekli Tepe to global attention, revealed a secret he had guarded for years. Hidden beneath streets, homes, and farmland near the Turkish city of Şanlıurfa lies Gürcütepe, a site most people have never heard of. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable compared to its world-famous neighbor, but Schmidt believed Gürcütepe could rewrite history. This single discovery shattered everything he thought he knew about the Neolithic.
Göbekli Tepe itself was the end of a process, not the beginning of a process. It was something that it was a marker. It was something that brought together the best of everything that they'd accumulated and created it in one place.
On his deathbed, he revealed that it wasn't just another mound, it was the missing piece. And the truth, he warned, was so shocking it could force archaeologists to redefine what came after humanity's first monumental temples. Where Gürcütepe sits and why it was missed. Gürcütepe lies on the flat Harran Plain, about 2 miles southeast of Şanlıurfa, Turkey, the same city Klaus Schmidt called home during his decades of work at Göbekli Tepe. In his private notes, he referred to it as the other site, the one few outsiders ever saw. To most visitors, it looked like nothing at all, but to Schmidt, it was the missing piece. The site covers an area roughly 4,000 feet by 2,600 feet and includes 8 distinct mounds or settlement areas, labeled Gürcütepe 1 through 8. These are not dramatic hilltops like Göbekli Tepe, but low rises and flat spaces scattered along the Surin stream. From the air, most of the site is now covered by modern buildings and roads. Decades of urban expansion have been built directly over ancient layers, leaving only small, isolated pockets accessible for excavation. The largest surviving open area is at Gürcütepe 3, where archaeologists have been able to carry out limited but targeted investigations. Even there, space is tight, and surrounding development poses ongoing risks to preservation. This lack of visibility is one reason Gürcütepe remained in the background for so long. Sites like Göbekli Tepe, with their striking stone pillars and clear outlines, naturally draw attention. By contrast, Gürcütepe's modest topography made it easy to overlook. In many places, archaeological remains lie just beneath streets or courtyards, out of sight and out of mind. Yet Schmidt knew size and scale do not tell the whole story. Surveys revealed that beneath the surface, Gürcütepe preserves a deep stratigraphy, in some places up to 6 meters thick. Within those layers is evidence spanning the late pre-pottery Neolithic, the first appearance of pottery, and later Hellenistic and Roman intrusions in the uppermost deposits. This makes Gürcütepe an unusually long-lived settlement in the region, with multiple phases of occupation stacked one atop another. The site's spread across both mound and flat areas also hints at complex use of space. Some zones may have been domestic clusters, others open areas for workshops or communal activities. Understanding that layout remains vital because it helped researchers like Schmidt trace changes in settlement patterns during the Neolithic and beyond. And to Schmidt, this overlooked, half-hidden location was not just background. It formed the final clue in a mystery he had been chasing until the day he died. He believed that what lay under these unremarkable patches of soil would tell a different kind of story than Göbekli Tepe's monumental enclosures. From Göbekli Tepe to Gürcütepe. Klaus Schmidt's name is inseparable from Göbekli Tepe. From 1996 until he died in 2014, he led the excavations that brought the site worldwide fame. His research transformed it from a little-known mound into one of archaeology's most celebrated discoveries, a monumental complex more than 11,000 years old. It challenged everything we thought we knew about the period. But Schmidt's work extended beyond that single hilltop. In 1995, before Göbekli Tepe's fame exploded, he began excavations at Gürcütepe, a site he quietly believed might one day hold a key as important as the pillars themselves. Gürcütepe offered a different challenge. Instead of a single, clearly defined site, it was a cluster of separate areas, Gürcütepe 1 through 4 being the initial focus. Schmidt and his team's aim was straightforward: open test trenches, establish the depth and sequence of occupation, and see how these settlements fit into the broader Neolithic landscape of southeastern Turkey. The earliest digs revealed complex stratigraphy. Gürcütepe Fern, for example, contained late pre-pottery Neolithic layers topped by deposits from the very first use of pottery, followed by Hellenistic and Roman intrusions in the upper soil. These findings showed that the site had been reused and reoccupied over thousands of years. In other words, it wasn't a one-period wonder. Gürcütepe 2 and 3 added further detail. The deposits in these areas were deep, suggesting long-term habitation. Stone foundations, pise walls, and domestic hearths emerged in the trenches, architecture that immediately contrasted with the massive carved pillars of Göbekli Tepe. These were spaces for living and working, not ceremonial monuments. For Schmidt, that difference was part of the intrigue. He was interested in how these domestic spaces might connect with the grand ritual sites. Were they contemporary, serving as the home base for the people who built Göbekli Tepe? Or did they belong to a later generation, after the era of giant stone enclosures had ended? The early seasons didn't give a definitive answer. Without a larger excavation area, the dating evidence was limited. But Schmidt took note of tool styles, architectural forms, and the presence of early pottery, all details that hinted at a chronological relationship different from what many assumed. He believed they were clues worth exploring further, even if they challenged previous thinking. Over time, Schmidt's dual focus, monumental Göbekli Tepe on one hand, plain-based Gürcütepe on the other, shaped his thinking. He began to see the two not as equals in scale or function, but as related points on a timeline. That idea, still forming during those early years, would become central to the conclusion he reached shortly before his death. Domestic scale versus monumental scale. The first seasons at Gürcütepe revealed a scene very different from Göbekli Tepe's towering pillars and animal carvings. Here, there were no monumental enclosures or megalithic sculptures dominating the landscape. Instead, the archaeology pointed toward everyday life, the structures, tools, and symbolic objects of a settled community. The cultural deposits were deep, in some places over 20 feet. At the bottom were late pre-pottery Neolithic levels. Above them, layers from the earliest use of pottery, and finally intrusive materials from later historical periods. In the Neolithic layers, the architecture followed a consistent pattern: rectangular houses with stone foundations and pise walls, often containing hearths and built-in features for daily activities. These were homes, not ceremonial spaces. Evidence of food preparation and craft production was abundant. Excavations uncovered hearths used for cooking, firing pits for heating materials, and middens filled with domestic waste. Workshops were identified by concentrations of tools and manufacturing debris. Flint knapping areas littered with stone flakes, ground stone implements for grinding grain, and pallets likely used for processing pigments or other materials. Symbolic objects were present, but they were different from Göbekli Tepe's monumental imagery. Limestone figurines appeared in both male and female forms, as well as in gender-neutral styles. One notable category was a set of overweight female figurines, a form less common in the earlier hilltop sites, but significant in the symbolic vocabulary of the later Neolithic. These figurines may have represented fertility, social roles, or community identity, but unlike the massive pillars of Göbekli Tepe, they were portable, objects of personal or household significance rather than public monuments. For Schmidt, these differences in symbolic expression were not just interesting. They were one of the clues he believed could unlock the missing piece in the Neolithic sequence. Tools and groundstone equipment pointed to a community engaged in both agriculture and specialized crafts. Axes, mortars, and pestles would have supported food production, while beads and bracelets suggested a tradition of personal ornamentation. This blend of subsistence and symbolic life fit the profile of a permanent settlement rather than a seasonal or ceremonial gathering place. For Klaus Schmidt, the contrast was striking. Göbekli Tepe had been built to awe and inspire on a regional scale, drawing people from across the landscape. Gürcütepe, on the other hand, seemed rooted in the rhythms of daily survival and craft production. It was a settlement with its own symbolic traditions, but they were integrated into domestic life, not set apart in monumental architecture. The question was whether this difference reflected a separate cultural group or a later stage in the same society that had once built the world's first great temples. Sadly, Klaus Schmidt wouldn't live to see the return to the site, yet the patterns uncovered here, in the heart of a seemingly ordinary settlement, would become central to the conclusion he shared only once, in the final days of his life. Those beliefs would go on to guide the later archaeological work that followed. The 2021 to 2022 return. After decades of limited access, Gürcütepe returned to the archaeological spotlight in 2021 and 2022, the first full investigation since Klaus Schmidt's early trenches. For the new team, it wasn't just another dig. It was a rare chance to explore one of the last open areas and to test some of the questions Schmidt had left behind. Aware that much of the site was already lost to modern construction, the new team focused on the best-preserved area, the western side of Gürcütepe 3rd. Here, they laid out a controlled 30 by 30 foot excavation grid to systematically expose what remained. Beneath the thin layer of modern agricultural soil, two distinct archaeological layers emerged. Layer 1 consisted of stone-founded buildings with large rectangular rooms, separated by open spaces that appeared to serve as workshops or communal working areas. Hearths, firing pits, and refuse deposits pointed to intensive domestic and craft activity. The finds from this layer included beads, bracelets, pallets, axes, mortars, pestles, and a variety of flaked stone tools, all the equipment needed for food preparation, ornament production, and daily life. Layer 2, lying beneath, revealed more rectangular houses with stone foundations and pisse walls. Hearths were again common, along with limestone and animal figurines, stone vessels, and beads. One area contained a concentrated flint knapping dump, evidence of organized tool production. Nearby, archaeologists identified a semicircle of post holes, likely the supports for a shelter or light structure. This suggested that parts of the settlement may have had temporary or open-sided buildings, perhaps for communal work or storage. The stratigraphy was clear and well preserved. The architecture in both layers shared consistent construction methods, but the deeper layers' finds hinted at a slightly earlier phase of occupation. Together, they provided a continuous record of life in the settlement, from the later pre-pottery Neolithic into the first appearance of pottery. For researchers, these results were invaluable. The controlled excavation allowed for careful sampling of soil, ecofacts, and artifacts, giving insight into everything from diet to craft specialization. This was a significant improvement over earlier, more limited trenching, and it allowed archaeologists to place Gürcütepe more precisely in the Neolithic sequence of the region. But the work also showed how much had already been lost. Just beyond the excavation grid, modern streets and buildings covered areas that once formed part of the settlement. The preserved pocket at Gürcütepe 3 was now a rare and shrinking window into the past. It was in this renewed phase of work that the timeline for Gürcütepe began to solidify, a development that would later confirm part of what Klaus Schmidt had long suspected. Daily life at the end of an era. If Göbekli Tepe was built to inspire awe, Gürcütepe was built to sustain life. The finds from Gürcütepe offer a detailed picture of how its inhabitants lived. Unlike the monumental settings of Göbekli Tepe, the town was a working settlement, and its material culture reflected the routines of daily survival and craft production. The stone tool assemblage was dominated by lithics characteristic of the pre-pottery Neolithic B period. Large byblos and palmyra-type arrowheads were common, indicating a tradition of hunting technology that persisted alongside domesticated food production. These arrowheads, along with knives and scrapers, suggest the community maintained skills for processing both plant and animal resources, a continuity that researchers, including Schmidt during his early work here, would have recognized as significant. Groundstone tools were also abundant. Mortars, pestles, and grinding slabs pointed to intensive cereal processing, while polished stone axes were likely used in woodworking or land clearance. Stone vessels, some plain, others finely finished, indicated both functional and possibly symbolic uses. Together, these tools show a community with a balanced economy, combining farming, herding, hunting, and craft. The faunal remains reinforce this picture. The majority of the animal bones came from domesticated sheep and goats, with pigs the next most common species. Cattle were present in smaller numbers, possibly used more for secondary products or as status animals. Remains of wild game, including deer and smaller species, confirmed that hunting was still part of the subsistence strategy. This mix suggests a community well adapted to settled life, but still drawing on wild resources. Personal ornaments were another defining feature of Gürcütepe's material culture. Beads and bracelets, made from stone, bone, and occasionally imported materials, pointed to decorative traditions and perhaps social signaling. Some beads may have been traded from other regions, indicating that Gürcütepe was connected to wider Neolithic networks. The figurines found at the site added a symbolic layer to this domestic world. Representations included male, female, and gender-neutral forms, with a notable emphasis on overweight female figures. These may have symbolized fertility, prosperity, or community identity. While not monumental in scale, their presence in domestic contexts suggests symbolism integrated into everyday life, rather than reserved for separate ceremonial spaces. For archaeologists, these finds were important for another reason. They aligned closely with material from later Neolithic phases elsewhere in the region. The tool types, animal husbandry patterns, and symbolic objects all hinted that Gürcütepe belonged to a later stage in the cultural sequence than Göbekli Tepe. That chronological hint, embedded in the bones, blades, and beads, would become central to Klaus Schmidt's final conclusion about Gürcütepe, where Gürcütepe sits on the timeline. By the time the 2021 to 2022 excavations were complete, the combined evidence from old and new work made it possible to place Gürcütepe firmly within the regional chronology, and closer to the heart of the mystery Klaus Schmidt had guarded for years. The architecture, tool types, and animal remains all pointed to a date in the late pre-pottery Neolithic B, PPNB, extending into the pre-pottery Neolithic C, PPNC in some areas. The easternmost part of the site showed PPNC material in particular, a phase that followed the peak of monumental building traditions in the region. This was significant because it placed Gürcütepe's main occupation after the period when Göbekli Tepe's giant stone enclosures were in use. While some earlier layers may overlap in time with Göbekli Tepe's later phases, the core of the settlement appeared younger. Architectural differences reinforce this dating. Whereas Göbekli Tepe featured massive T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in circular or oval enclosures, Gürcütepe's buildings were small, rectangular, and built for domestic use. The shift in construction style is widely interpreted as part of a broader lifestyle change, from communal, labor-intensive ritual projects to smaller, household-focused settlements. Environmental and cultural factors likely played a role in this transition. Towards the end of the PPNB, large ceremonial sites across the region were abandoned. Researchers link this to climate fluctuations, changing subsistence strategies, and the movement of populations from upland limestone plateaus down to fertile plains. Gürcütepe, situated on the Harran Plain, fits neatly into this pattern. The finds supported this later dating. The presence of early pottery, advanced groundstone tool technology, and a diversified subsistence base are all indicators of a community living after the monumental era had begun to fade. Even symbolic traditions, such as the overweight female figurines, align more closely with later Neolithic cultural expressions than with the iconography of Göbekli Tepe. For archaeologists, dating is more than a number. It is the framework for interpreting why a site existed and how it related to others. In this case, the dating placed Gürcütepe in a key transitional period, when communities were redefining their social structures and adapting to new environmental realities. Klaus Schmidt understood the importance of this placement early on. He recognized that Gürcütepe could hold the story of what came after the first great temples, and perhaps why that era ended. He had begun forming a conclusion about this timeline years before his death. Schmidt wanted people to know the truth about the site he had dedicated so much of his life to, so that archaeologists who came after him could carry on his work. Without his knowledge, much of what we now know about Gürcütepe likely wouldn't be possible. What Schmidt underlined. Before he died, archaeologist Klaus Schmidt revealed the shocking truth about Gürcütepe. For years, he had worked quietly on the site while the world focused on Göbekli Tepe. Publicly, his attention seemed fixed on the massive hilltop complex, but in private, he spoke of Gürcütepe as a crucial piece of the puzzle. Those who worked with him recall that he often compared the two and hinted that the plain-based site might hold the key to understanding why the era of monumental building ended. Shortly before he died in 2014, Schmidt reportedly told a colleague, in a moment of uncharacteristic urgency, "I can't keep this hidden." It wasn't a confession about artifacts or looting. It was about timing, and the story the dates were telling him. For Schmidt, this was the shocking truth. The romance of a vanished civilization gave way to a more nuanced story of adaptation and resilience. What the layers revealed would force him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about the Neolithic. And once the evidence came into focus, the picture it formed was nothing short of disruptive. It pointed to a timeline no one had expected, one that rewrote Göbekli Tepe's story. The evidence indicated that Gürcütepe was significantly younger than Göbekli Tepe. Its main occupation dates to the late PPNB and into the PPNC, a phase that came after Göbekli Tepe's ceremonial enclosures had already fallen out of use. This meant that Gürcütepe wasn't a contemporary home base for the builders of Göbekli Tepe, as some earlier theories suggested. Instead, it represented what came next: a shift from large communal hilltop monuments to smaller, domestically focused settlements on fertile plains. In Schmidt's view, this change marked a profound cultural turning point. The implications were wide-reaching. Göbekli Tepe has often been interpreted as evidence of a lost ancient complexity, a society that invested extraordinary labor into symbolic architecture long before the advent of cities or writing. Placing Gürcütepe firmly after that period reframed the narrative. It suggested continuity rather than collapse. The people who abandoned monumental buildings did not disappear, but reorganized their lives around different priorities. By revealing this sequence, Schmidt challenged a popular narrative that saw Göbekli Tepe's end as a mysterious break. Instead, he proposed a transition, one that could only be fully understood by studying sites like Gürcütepe. For decades, the prevailing view was that complex societies capable of large-scale architecture, symbolic art, and organized religion only emerged with the first cities around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. Yet here are two sites in southeastern Anatolia, more than twice that age, showing organized construction, shared belief systems, and intricate craftsmanship. They aren't anomalies in isolation. When sites like Gürcütepe are properly dated and contextualized, they lend weight to the theory that advanced, interconnected cultures may have existed long before recorded history. The evidence isn't always monumental stonework. Sometimes it's the sophistication of tools, the complexity of symbolic systems, or the organization of settlements in challenging environments. Together, they suggest that humanity's path to civilization may have been far less linear than once believed, with cycles of development, disruption, and reinvention stretching back much further. In this light, Gürcütepe is not just a footnote to Göbekli Tepe, but part of a broader, still unfolding story about forgotten chapters in the human past. With the dating now supported by recent excavations, Schmidt's final insight stands as his last and most enduring contribution, a reminder that the story of the Neolithic is not just about what was built, but also about how people learned to live after the great stones were left behind. And it was this truth, uncovered in the final years of his life, that he refused to keep hidden. Abandonment, climate, and the next questions. Today, Gürcütepe is more than an archaeological site. It is a case study in how human societies adapt. The evidence from both past and recent excavations places it squarely in the period following the abandonment of Göbekli Tepe and other monumental sites across southeastern Anatolia. This makes it a rare window into what happened after one of prehistory's most remarkable building traditions came to an end. Current research aims to do more than confirm dates. Archaeologists are reconstructing the site's paleogeography to understand the environmental context in which its people lived. They are analyzing soil samples for plant remains, studying animal bones for evidence of herding and hunting strategies, and examining tool-making debris to map patterns of craft production. Each strand of evidence contributes to a clearer picture of the settlement's economy and social structure. The leading hypothesis is that a combination of climate change and shifting cultural priorities led to the move from upland limestone hills to fertile plains like the Heron Plain. Wetter or drier phases could have altered resource availability, making lowland farming more attractive and reducing the need for large-scale communal projects. In this reading, Gürcütepe was part of a broader regional shift towards smaller, self-sufficient communities. The symbolism found at the site, such as figurines, ornaments, and decorated tools, also tells a story. While no longer carved into megaliths towering over open enclosures, symbolic expression remained important. It was simply embedded into domestic spaces, suggesting that belief systems adapted alongside social organization. The overweight female figurines, in particular, may reflect changing ideas about fertility, abundance, or community identity in the later Neolithic. Preservation, however, is a pressing concern. Modern construction has destroyed large parts of Gürcütepe, leaving only fragments accessible for study. Without focused protection, even those surviving pockets could be lost, erasing vital evidence of this transitional period. For those who knew Klaus Schmidt's work, the importance of Gürcütepe is now clear. It confirms that the story of early complex societies is not one of abrupt disappearance, but of transformation. The shocking truth he pointed to was not a hidden monument or lost treasure, but a timeline that reframes the end of the world's first monumental age as a transformation rather than a collapse. If Gürcütepe preserves the record of what came after the great stone temples, how much more could we learn if the entire site were still intact? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.